Okay, so Double Demons has a magic combat system. It's real time. You're firing missile spells, and they're firing spells back at you. But there's a lot going on that kind of feeds into the overall themes behind the game. There's a conservation of mana of sorts, which basically means that when you cast a spell, it has maybe like 20 mana, and you have like 100 mana total. So you could cast 5 spell missiles, and they kind of arc out and they go towards the enemy. The enemy actually, and it's sort of a medieval themed weapons to kind of go alongside the magic element, could have like a magic sword of some kind. And if they slash through your missile as it gets to them, instead of dealing damage, they'll actually absorb the power of that spell into their mana pool. So you shoot a spell, 20 mana, they slash through it, they gain 20 mana, and they can go over their mana cap. So this was an idea I had very early on with the magic system that kind of creates always really interesting consequences. So first off, of course, you could have spells in your kind of inventory cooldown bar at the bottom that cost more mana than you can ever have at like a default. So by firing spells back and forth between an enemy or a friend, you can build up massive mana pools, and maybe there's a second mana cap. So there's your default mana cap 100. Maybe you have a default mana cap that you can also increase that would be like 200 or 300. So once you get more mana than you have, maybe some of your extremely powerful spells become active. You can cast like a massive rainstorm of missiles, or effects with like crowd control, stuff like that. So you got this system, but it quickly became obvious that if you can block spells and you can only fire so many, even with the escalating system, it becomes overall a little bit too easy to never deal damage to the other person. It's not quite the level of energy and sort of panic that I want in a battle zone. So I realized that there needed to be some way to make the magic attacks harder to predict and harder to block. So actually, now the way that it works is there's a whole pre-visualization, and this kind of feeds into the kind of the same philosophy that I went with the conversation system. I wanted there to be clear feedback when you say stuff, but also you have some sort of idea what you're doing. So when you go to cast a spell, you can see the entire arc of the line that the missile will fall through the air. So you can see, okay, it'll kind of raise up and then explode near the enemy if that's where you're aiming. But actually, when you press the trigger, if you keep holding down the trigger, you can redirect that arc. So imagine you had like an invisible thread to your magic missile as it moves through the air. You can kind of pull it, to the side or up or down, and in that way you can make it a lot less predictable. Like you can kind of make it wobble a little bit. Now you have a limited control after you initially fire the spell how far you can move it, but you can move it quite a bit. And the earlier on in the arc, the more you can move it. Of course, when it gets really close to its target, it only has a tiny range that you can move it more from that point. So now that you can fire and redirect, you actually should, in many cases, the strategy could be you would purposefully miss, fire far to the right, and then curveball it over to hit them from the side. In fact, if you are close enough and have the range, you could probably fire it so it would go over their heads and then pull it back towards them so it almost comes straight down on them. That would probably be a lot harder to pull off, but it's all possible within this system. So then you start to have a really fascinating thing, which I've been chasing for a really long time with VR, that I think a lot of other developers have struggled with, and I'm still working out the kinks. It's not an easy system to balance or make fluid, but I think I've got it. And you could be getting this full body of motion that's actually meaningful motion. Like I'm not, and I don't want to be hard on all the magic systems that are making people do hand gestures. I think those are really cool and do feel really great, but I'm trying to follow in the philosophy of other games, of competitive games, and competitive games at like an esports level are not generally having you create gestures that are, in some words, like a long cut. Like it's not a shortcut to cast a spell. Like in League of Legends, you have quick cast, where you have no pre-visualization at all, but you have in memory what will happen so that you can instantly cast things. A lot of esports level games are that way with instantaneous action. So a gesture like, doing like a ring to select a spell would be, in my opinion, less esports consistent, because you're slowing down the action in order, you know exactly what you want to do, but you can't do it instantly because there's a selection process. So I'm comparing this because there's still a gestural movement, but first off, it's not required. If you know exactly the arc that you want it to take, and it's a simple arc, you can cast that immediately, know exactly how it's going to fire, and move your attention to something else. So that's the other thing, is in many games, even without a gesture system for casting magic spells, you have to see, you're kind of like, okay, my hand's going like this. Maybe there's a slight, like, small trail, but very few games do an entire arc visualized. And part of that is just because, how fun would it be if you could know beforehand that your missile's going to hit its target. Now, in my game, the target could also be moving. So even if you see exactly that it would hit them while they're still, you don't know that they won't move. And then there's a second layer, of course, they could block it. So even though you can know immediately when you cast the spell exactly where it's going to go and if it's going to hit them if they stay still, that's not where you're done. And the gesture becomes not a selection gesture that I think ideally in an esports world could be shortened to an instantaneous action. The gesture is, I'm adding live input to the path of the spell. I'm saying, okay, I'm firing it way off to the right and I'm going to curveball it from them. And then as my hand does that gesture, now my hand is positioned to fire way off to the left and curve that back to the right. So you can actually have these wildly flailing, mage arm motions where you're doing something that is translating to the game as far as input in a very tactile way. So fire a spell off to the right, curve in, fire a spell off to the left, curve in. So you can and then the person that is defending against these spells is having to, similar to Beat Saber in a lot of ways, but probably without any sort of rhythm, probably very chaotically, is, slashing through spells on both sides or up and down. Maybe one of the ideal strategies could be, aiming at their feet so the blast radius hits them and they have a hard time blocking the core of the spell, which is probably what you'll need to do in order to block all of the damage. So then you might be walking backwards or something like that, or walking forwards to catch the missile before it hits the ground at your feet. So there's a lot more dance to positioning that's going on. And I'm hoping that the dream, which I think a lot of people have for Magic systems, that you'll be doing these cool mage-like motions with your arms to, create these complex spells. I've always believed that those complex motions need to be driving specific properties of those spells, not selection of the spells as much as a input to tell that spell to do a very specific thing, to arc this way, to explode early, or as I add more spells, I'll probably have those motions do other things. I'm also very interested in the idea of having a spell that takes both hands to control. Like, okay, you can do simple redirection arcs with one hand, but maybe with two hands you could have one hand act as a pivot and orient the missile like in a circle, or maybe as a scale you could spread out the missile to do less damage but over a wider AoE. There's all sorts of interesting ways that you could connect the physical motion of the VR controllers into your like a real spell creation live on the battlefield. So I'm really excited about that. And again, I think it follows in the philosophies that I'm applying to the conversation system too. And I've already gone in the past, I think in the previous video, of why I have both systems at the same time. The dating elements of the game, I think, would be strongest if there's a parallel separation between the rewards of the dating system. When you succeed in certain areas, you're not just, seeing that in the conversation or your relationship growth, but you're also seeing it as a multiplier on your XP gain in the spirit world when you're fighting monsters. Okay, I got that girl to go out with me and now she's my girlfriend. I'm seeing a boosted level of experience in this skill tree. Is I think an important addition to make the player more encouraged to pursue all sorts of whatever conversation options they want to choose or whatever relationships they want to choose or not choose. I think it should be supported by the game as a play style, maybe a very difficult play style, to spurn all females in the game and either pursue friendship or just pursue maybe a more lonely adventure. Maybe eventually there's some character, any character that you enjoy spending time with. There will be a lot of them, so hopefully. But maybe your goals are elsewhere, and I want to support that, because only by allowing players to play in all the different ways can you, I guess, allow a player to feel like they're choosing the way that they're playing in the first place. But yeah, I'll probably talk more about the magic system in the future. I'll see you next time.